Red-eye gravy from ham drippings and coffee, hoe cakes on cast iron with last night's grease, crackling bread with pork skin in the cornmeal. Your grandmother kept a family fed on less than $1 a morning. Here are 30 cheap breakfasts black seniors living alone once made for under $1 each. Red-eye gravy turned almost nothing into something you could taste for the rest of the morning. You pour black coffee into the hot drippings left from frying a thin slice of country ham, watch the dark liquid settle with a reddish eye floating in the skillet, and ladled it over yesterday's biscuits. Biscuits going stiff soaked the gravy better than fresh ones. Nobody measured the coffee. You poured until the color looked right, let it bubble a minute, and that was all. The technique spread across Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas under names like poor man's gravy and bird's eye gravy, traveling north with the Great Migration tucked inside the habits of women who had learned it by watching rather than reading. A heel of salt pork stretched across several mornings. Black coffee was already on the stove. What you got for that, almost nothing, was a hot, savory start that tasted like somebody cared. Red-eye gravy has left the table now, a casualty of pans that never build a crust worth scraping. The egg went in last and you had to know when. If the grits had stopped bubbling but were still steaming, that was the moment. You pressed it well into the center with the back of a spoon, cracked the egg directly in, covered the pot, and let the heat finish it. This was not a recipe from a card. It was knowledge held in hands that had been stretching a meal for generations, producing a full breakfast from 2 ingredients that cost less than a dime in the 1950s. Grits are among the oldest foods in African American kitchens, ground from hominy corn using Native American nixtamalization, a process that unlocks nutrients plain grinding cannot release, and carried through Southern cooking from plantation quarters to city apartments. One pot, one flame, one dish to wash. For a woman living alone after her children had gone north, that economy mattered. The yolk broke when you pressed it and spread through the grits like a slow yellow sauce. Nobody makes it that way anymore. She started it before you woke up. You heard the scrape of the spoon against the skillet, the low hiss when the batter hit the fat. The batter was nothing. Cornmeal, water, salt, and whatever grease was saved in the tin beside the stove. You pressed each spoonful flat, and what came off was a crisp-edged corn cake with a soft center. What you ate it with was the sap, molasses, and warm leftover grease stirred together in the skillet after the last cake came off. Black Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama gave that combination its name, gravy and syrup both, costing nothing and wasting nothing. The knowledge of how hot to run the skillet lived in your ears. You knew by the sound, not by a timer, not by a recipe. That knowledge passed by standing next to her on Saturday mornings. When she stopped making them, it stopped being passed. Cold cornbread broken into a glass of buttermilk needed no stove, no fire, no preparation beyond a spoon. In North Louisiana, it barely counted as cooking. It was just what you did when the kitchen was cold and the morning hadn't earned more effort than that. You crumbled the cornbread in, poured buttermilk over it until the bread softened and the liquid turned faintly yellow, and ate it standing at the counter. The tang cut through the corn, the bread thickened as it sat, and the whole thing filled you the way only starch and fat can, slowly, completely, without drama. The African American Registry documents this as a recorded morning meal across Black Southern households where buttermilk kept without refrigeration and cost pennies a glass. It fed you before a long day in somebody else's kitchen. It has left the table almost entirely now, replaced by things that come in boxes and require considerably more of everything except memory. But before the box things arrived, there was crackling bread, cornbread baked with bits of rendered pork skin folded directly into the batter, the same skin cooked down in a cast iron pot until it crisped into small, brown, intensely savory cracklings. You mix them into cornmeal, water, salt, and soda, bake the whole thing in a heavy skillet, and what came out was dense, rich, and crackling studded, with a bottom crust nobody who grew up eating it ever forgot. Sorghum syrup finished it, and sorghum carried African roots, brought to the American South from West Africa in the early 17th century, where it was called Guinea corn and had been used as a primary sweetener and grain staple for generations before the first enslaved person reached this shore. Crackling bread cost almost nothing when the hog had already been rendered. You used what the butchering left behind. It disappeared when hog rendering days ended and the cracklings went with them. The last woman who made it right held knowledge about cast iron and rendered fat that has never been written down. Peanut butter spread on a scratch biscuit was a breakfast with 2 layers of history in it. The biscuit, flour, lard, buttermilk, salt, just enough baking powder to raise it, had been on African American morning tables since before the Civil War, shaped by hands that knew the dough by feel, not measurement. The peanut butter carried older roots, tracing back to West African groundnut traditions that arrived in the memories of enslaved people long before the commercial jar existed. By the Depression years, the Bureau of Home Economics was promoting peanut butter as a protein substitute for meat-struggling families could no longer afford, and in Black households that had been stretching protein for generations, it needed no advertisement. A jar cost a few cents and lasted the week. 2 biscuits spread thick held a person through the morning without complaint. The biscuits were made in a batch on Sunday and eaten through Wednesday. Nobody from those kitchens ever needed to be told what to do with a stale biscuit. Cornmeal porridge with blackstrap molasses told you, without sentimentality, exactly where you stood and what you were going to do about it. You cooked the cornmeal slow in water or thin milk until it thickened, then drizzled blackstrap molasses over the top in a slow spiral that sank in before you stirred it through. Blackstrap molasses was a staple of African American pantries for generations, the dark, bitter, mineral-rich byproduct of refining sugar cane, costing far less than refined sugar and delivering considerably more nutrition: iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium, the minerals that kept working bodies going when meat was scarce and vegetables were seasonal. Enslaved people and their descendants depended on molasses as a primary sweetener from the 17th century onward, long before it became a Depression-era substitute. For those stretched thin through the lean years, this was the morning that made the rest possible. It cost pennies. It was warm, filling, and bittersweet in a way plain porridge never managed. She watched you finish every spoonful before you were allowed to leave. Milk toast sounds like nothing, and for a long stretch of history, that was the point. You toasted a slice of bread until it firmed, placed it in a shallow bowl, poured warm milk over it, sweetened with a spoon of sugar or a pinch of salt, depending on the house, and let it soak until the bread softened into something between solid and liquid. It had been called sick room food since the 19th century, given to people recovering from illness or to young children who needed something easy to get down. But in Black households during the Depression, when the stove was cold and the pantry held milk and stale bread and not much else, milk toast was simply breakfast. Some households added a drop of vanilla or cinnamon stirred into the warm milk before pouring. Those additions were not in any recipe. They came from whoever stood at the stove and whatever she felt that morning deserved. The last time you had it was probably the last time she was there to make it. The grease tin sat on the back of the stove, and everyone knew not to touch it without a reason. Bacon grease was saved after every frying, poured through a strainer into a metal can, kept at room temperature, used for seasoning cast iron, starting gravy, and frying the next morning's bread. On mornings when the pantry was light, it went onto a slice of bread. You spread it right to the edges, either ate it cold with coffee or ran it under the broiler until the fat melted in and the edges crisped. Either way, it tasted rich and smoky in a way bread only tastes when animal fat has entered it. Saving bacon grease was not just frugality, it was a philosophy. Nothing in the African American kitchen was more fundamental than the idea that what was rendered from the hog belonged to the cook and would be honored by using every last drop. That practice is nearly gone. She knew its value without ever naming it. Crackers and cane syrup required almost no thought and almost no effort, and that was its value on a weekday morning when the stove wasn't warm. You laid out soda crackers on a plate and poured cane syrup over them in slow amber loops until each cracker pooled in sweetness, then ate them before they lost their snap. The whole pleasure was the contrast between the salt and the syrup's deep, dark sweetness. Cane syrup was a foundational pantry item in Black Southern households, made from sugar cane juice cooked down into a thick, richly flavored syrup, sweeter than molasses but less bitter, far cheaper than refined sugar, and lasting months without refrigeration. It stretched across dozens of breakfasts, sweetening biscuits, hoe cakes, and cornbread, the same way jam sweetened toast in households that could afford jam. On mornings when nothing else was ready, and every household had those mornings, crackers and cane syrup was the answer. It cost almost nothing. It got you out the door. If crackers and cane syrup asked nothing, Potlikker and cornbread gave everything, turning what most kitchens threw away into a breakfast that held a body through a full workday. Potlikker is the dark, mineral-rich broth left after greens and salt pork have simmered for hours. Former slave Carol Graham of Alabama described children standing around a pot of greens liquor, crumbling cornbread into the liquid with spoons, and WP, a federal writers project, records. After emancipation, the practice carried on. You heated the pot from the night before, crumbled yesterday's cornbread into a bowl, poured the hot liquid over it, and let the bread swell into something between soup and porridge. The nutrition was real. Iron and folate from the greens, protein from the pork, the slow fuel of cornmeal, and it cost nothing beyond what supper had already spent. Most people living alone today have never heard of starting the morning this way. The pots went first, and then the knowledge went with them. Corn pone was not cornbread. No eggs, no leavening, no buttermilk, just cornmeal, water, and salt pressed into thick rounds and baked on the skillet until the outside formed a thin, crisp crust and the inside stayed dense in the way only water and cornmeal can. The technique came directly from enslaved communities where ash cakes and pone were the most fundamental corn preparations. What Dr. Martha Barenda, director of the Blanchard House Museum of African History and Culture in Punta Gorda, Florida, identified as rooted in the West African relationship with grain, carried intact through every generation that followed emancipation. In the mornings, you reheated a piece from the day before in the same skillet where the fatback had fried, so the pone soaked up the drippings and developed a brown, greasy, savory bottom crust. You broke it into a bowl and poured warm, rendered fatback drippings over the top, a loose, clear gravy that wasted nothing from the morning's frying, dense enough to hold you through hours of labor. It asked nothing except the willingness to use what was already in the pan. Salt pork hash started the night before, whether you knew it or not. You left the cold potatoes from supper on the counter, and in the morning, diced them alongside whatever salt pork had been sitting in brine. The fatty, cured cut that cost less than bacon and kept longer than almost anything else in the icebox. You cooked it all in the cast iron skillet, the pork rendering its fat first, the potatoes pressing flat until the underside crisped into something golden, salty, and unrepeatable. Salt pork was a documented weekly ration staple in black households from the era of slavery through the Great Depression. The cut that stretched furthest when cooked against a skillet of potatoes and onion. You knew the hash was done when the kitchen smelled like it was done. There was no timer for that. Nobody makes it anymore, and nobody who didn't grow up with that cast iron skillet will ever quite get the crust right. Pain, perdu, lost bread is what Louisiana Creole cooks called French toast, because the whole point was to save bread already on its way out. Day-old French bread, stale enough to hold the custard without dissolving, was soaked in beaten eggs, milk, sugar, and a pinch of nutmeg, then fried in a cast iron skillet in lard. Always lard in the early recipes because lard ran hotter and gave the exterior a slightly crisp, deeply golden crust that butter alone cannot produce. The dish appeared in Louisiana cookbooks going back to the early 1800s and lived in Black Creole households as a morning staple and a way to honor bread that had gone hard. You carried the bread to the pan, not the pan to the bread, meaning you adjusted your timing and heat to match the bread's condition. A plate of pain perdu cost almost nothing and tasted like deliberate cooking rather than desperation. That alchemy, something nearly ruined, turned into something worth sitting down for, was the signature skill of these kitchens. Kushkush was the Cajun and Creole fried cornmeal breakfast that most people outside Louisiana have never heard of, and most people inside Louisiana have stopped making. You made a thick batter from cornmeal, salt, baking powder, and milk, then scraped it into a cast iron skillet coated in bacon drippings. The key was that you did not stir it. You left the batter alone, let the bottom crust form, then broke it apart with a spatula into rough, crispy clumps. Then you poured warm milk and cane syrup over the plate and ate it immediately. The 1901 Picayune's Creole cookbook documented kushkush as a traditional Cajun farm kitchen breakfast. It was cheap, filling, and required a practiced hand. Most people under 60 have never tasted it. Most people over 80 remember it the way they remember a specific grandmother, vividly and with the knowledge that it is gone. Callas were rice fritters sold on the streets of New Orleans' French Quarter by black women who carried them in covered bowls on their heads, calling out Belle Callas, tout chaud, beautiful Callas, all hot. The name came from the Nupe word cara, meaning fried cake, carried to Louisiana by enslaved West Africans from rice-growing regions of West Africa who adapted their knowledge of rice cooking to the new country. You made the batter the night before, cooked rice mixed with yeast and left to proof overnight, then combined in the morning with eggs, sugar, flour, cinnamon, and nutmeg before being spooned into hot oil and fried golden. Under Spanish colonial rule, some enslaved black women used the money from selling Callas on Sundays, the one day they had off, to purchase their own freedom. The dish appeared in the 1901 Picayune's Creole cookbook. After World War II, it slipped from the streets and then from the kitchens. The women who sold Callas were gone long before the recipe nearly followed them. You cut the hole with a glass. That was the official method. Press the rim of a juice glass into the center of a slice of day-old bread, twist once, and pull out the circle. You laid the bread flat in a skillet coated in bacon grease, cracked an egg directly into the hole, and cooked it on both sides until the white set and the bread crisped around the edges. The little circle that came out of the hole got fried in the same pan and eaten alongside. Nothing wasted, not even the cutout. The technique showed up in Depression-era cookbooks under names like Egg in a Basket, One-Eyed Sam, and Sunshine Bread. In Black households, it appeared without a name, just as the thing you made when you had one egg and half a loaf of bread that was a day too old to eat plain. It cost almost nothing and felt like more than almost nothing, which was the whole point of knowing how to cook. Kush cake, a sweet fried cornmeal cake, belonged entirely to kitchens that had mastered the art of making something taste like it cost more than it did. You made a thick batter from cornmeal, a little sugar, fat, and water, then dropped spoonfuls into a hot skillet and fried them until the edges crisped and the centers stayed soft and slightly grainy. Dr. Martha Berenda, director of the Blanchard House Museum of African History and Culture in Punta Gorda, Florida, identified kush cake as one of the essential cornmeal preparations in the African American cooking tradition, rooted in the West African relationship with grain and carried through enslaved communities into the free kitchen. It was sweet, but not dessert sweet, more like something made a little better than it needed to be because the morning deserved it. You ate it hot, right from the pan. There was no point eating it cold. It was only itself when it was fresh, and the same was true of the kitchen it came from. Sorghum syrup and butter on a piece of skillet bread was the breakfast that asked nothing of the morning except that the bread still be warm. You tore off a piece of whatever cornbread or hoe cake was left from the day before, spread softened butter across the surface until it melted into the crumb, then drizzled sorghum syrup over the top in slow amber loops. Sorghum had been a household staple in Black Southern kitchens since before the Civil War. A thick, dark, deeply flavored syrup made from the sorghum plant, brought from Africa and grown across the South as a reliable, low-cost sweetener that kept without refrigeration. In those kitchens, a jar of sorghum on the table was as ordinary as salt. You didn't think about it, you just reached for it. The morning your grandmother died, somebody moved that jar to a cabinet. The counter looked strange without it. It took years before anyone noticed nobody had replaced it, and by then, the bread that needed it had stopped being made too. Salt mackerel had to be thought about the night before, and that discipline, the planning required to make something cheap taste right, was a kind of expertise that modern kitchens have largely lost. You pulled the stiff, brine-cured fish from its wrapping, placed it in a bowl of cold water before bed, and by morning the salt had drawn down enough that what you put in the skillet was firm, faintly briny, and ready to fry in bacon drippings until golden on both sides. Salt mackerel was a documented staple in Black Southern and Northern households across the 19th and early 20th centuries, a preserved fish that cost almost nothing, kept for weeks without refrigeration, and provided protein on mornings when nothing else in the pantry could. You served it with cornbread and sometimes a sliced raw onion, the sharpness cutting through the fish's richness in a way nobody who grew up eating it ever forgot. The ritual of the overnight soaking was the price of admission. If you didn't know to soak it the night before, you weren't ready to cook it at all. Rice cooked with evaporated milk and sugar smelled like someone was taking care of you. You combined leftover rice with evaporated milk from the can, a spoonful of sugar, and a pinch of salt, then cooked it low and slow until the milk thickened around the rice into something warm and faintly sweet. Evaporated milk was a Depression-era pantry staple in Black households where fresh milk was unaffordable. The canned version cost far less and lasted. West African culinary traditions had long used rice in sweetened porridges, and the evaporated milk version that emerged in American black kitchens was a practical adaptation of that older instinct. Take what was available and make it comforting. For a senior living alone, 1 can of evaporated milk and a cup of leftover rice produced 2 full mornings for almost nothing. The ones who made it knew the exact moment to pull it from the heat, when the surface just stopped moving. You never got that right the first time you tried it alone. Spoon bread was not cornbread and was not quite pudding. It was something softer than both, a baked cornmeal custard that came out of the oven, trembling slightly in the center, and had to be served with a spoon because it would not hold the shape of a slice. The dish had deep roots in African American Virginia kitchens, made with fine ground cornmeal, eggs, milk or buttermilk, butter, and leavening, baked in a heavy dish until the top was golden and the inside stayed creamy and yielding. Its origins traced to baked cornmeal dishes that enslaved cooks prepared in plantation kitchens, and it appeared in Virginia cookbooks as early as the mid-1800s. On Sunday mornings, some households made spoon bread as the one hot preparation that was substantial without being laborious, eaten alongside whatever else was on the table before church. For a senior living alone, a small batch cost under $1 and produced a breakfast warm enough to count as real cooking on a morning when real cooking felt necessary. The women who made it without measuring anything are gone, and the dish went quiet with them. Black coffee with a biscuit and sorghum was the breakfast at the far end of the table, the one that said the morning was already running. You broke yesterday's biscuit in half, spread sorghum into the hollow of each half, then ate it standing over the counter with a cup of black coffee that had been on the stove long enough to lose any kindness it once had. In black Southern households during the 1940s and 50s, this was the everyday start, not the Sunday version, just the version the day required before it would agree to begin. Chicory coffee was common in households that stretched the grounds across several pots, adding dried chicory root the way New Orleans had been doing it since the Civil War blockades first made coffee scarce. You didn't sit down for this breakfast. You drank it standing and then you left. Now even the sorghum is hard to find, and the biscuits that needed it stopped being made when the hands that made them stopped. Bread pudding for breakfast was not a leftover. It was made on purpose to rescue bread that had gone too stale to eat any other way. You broke the stale bread into pieces in a baking dish, poured over it a custard of beaten eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla, and a pinch of nutmeg. Then let it soak overnight so the bread absorbed every drop before you slid it into a low oven in the morning. What came out was custardy and golden on top, soft and deeply flavored in the center. In New Orleans, Creole households, bread pudding has been documented as a morning preparation since the early 20th century, a practical use of day-old French bread that was too valued to discard. For a senior living alone with half a loaf gone hard on the counter, it cost almost nothing beyond what was already in the house. The woman who taught you to make it told you to start it the night before. Nobody starts it the night before anymore. That's why nobody makes it right. But the most elemental breakfast in these kitchens was not the one that took the most skill. It was the one that required you to have been paying attention for years. Hominy grits with Potlikker was made by taking plain cooked grits and ladling over the top the dark, savory broth left from simmered greens. Hominy is one of the oldest processed foods in North American cooking, made from dried corn treated with an alkaline solution in a Native American process called nixtamalization that unlocks nutrients the untreated grain cannot provide, a technique African American cooks carried and adapted through generations of Southern cooking. Potlikker was documented as a healing remedy in Black households. Storyteller Jackie Torrance described her grandmother making it from mustard greens, collard greens, pinto beans, and potatoes, used both as food and as a treatment for earache. Ladled over hot grits, it transformed the plain bowl into something savory and complete. You knew to save the potlikker. Most people today don't know there was anything to save. Dried fruit had to be stewed the night before, and that was never a problem because starting things the night before was just how those kitchens worked. You soaked dried peaches or apples or prunes in a pot of water before bed, added a little sugar and a cinnamon stick, and let them simmer low in the morning while the cornmeal mush cooked on the back burner. When you ladled the fruit, soft, swollen, fragrant with warm spice, over the plain white bowl of mush, you had a breakfast that cost almost nothing and tasted like something that had been planned for you. Drying fruit was a preservation technique African American households had used since the 19th century, when summer abundance had to be carried through winter in some form that wouldn't spoil. By the 1960s, dried fruit from the store had made home drying unnecessary, but the habit of stewing it for morning persisted in kitchens where the old ways hadn't yet been replaced by anything better. The morning she made it for the last time, she didn't know it was the last time. The bean pot never fully emptied. That was not a rule exactly, but an understanding built into how those kitchens worked. You made a big pot of beans on Monday, ate from it through the week, and by Friday morning, what was left was thick and nearly solid, the beans beginning to fall apart and the liquid reduced to something almost gravy-like. You added water, set it back on the stove on low, and let it thin back into something you could eat from a bowl with cornbread crumbled in. The result was not what the beans had been on Monday. It was richer, deeper, the flavors pressed together by days of slow cooling and reheating into a complexity a fresh pot could never have. For a senior living alone in the 1960s or 70s, this was not a last resort. It was the expected end of a bean pot, the thing the pot was always moving toward. The recipe for what they became on Friday morning was never written anywhere. Nobody thought to write it down. Sweet potato mashed in warm milk crossed the line between breakfast and comfort without asking permission. You baked or boiled a sweet potato the night before, mashed it smooth in the morning while the milk was warming, then stirred the two together into a thick orange, gently sweet porridge, seasoned with a little butter, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a drizzle of sorghum. The West African tradition of combining starchy roots with sweetened liquids to make morning porridge runs through the foodways documented by the Gula Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which traces how enslaved Africans from root cooking cultures of West Africa adapted their morning practices to the American South. Sweet potato porridge was cheap, warming, and rich in beta-carotene and natural sugars that provided real morning fuel. For a senior living alone, one medium sweet potato and a cup of milk produced a full bowl for pennies. The last person in a lot of families who made it this way made it without knowing anyone would ever ask how. Crackling bread soaked in potlikker was the breakfast that happened at the intersection of two separate things already made for other purposes. And it was the kind of breakfast that could only be invented by someone who had been cooking long enough to know that the most powerful combinations often come from what's already there. You heated the potlikker from the night before until it was steaming, broke a piece of crackling bread into a deep bowl, and poured the hot liquid over it until the dense, pork-studded bread softened and the two flavors pressed together into something that was neither bread nor soup, but better than both. It cost nothing beyond what supper had already made. It required no recipe. It required only the habit of saving things, the bread, the pot, the potlikker, and the knowledge that they belonged together. That knowledge was never written down. The people who held it are mostly gone now, and the habits went with them. In the end, it was a piece of cornbread and a cup of black coffee, not as a last resort, not as a punishment, just as the most elemental version of the morning, reduced to what it always was, grain and heat and something bitter to wake you up. The cornbread was from the day before, slightly stale, and you ate it as it was, because sometimes the morning didn't ask for anything more. In black households across the South and the urban North, through the Depression and the war years and the migrations and the long decades after, cornbread and black coffee was the floor, the breakfast below all other breakfasts, the one that required nothing from the pantry except what was always there. For a senior living alone, having come north with very little, a piece of cornbread and a cup of black coffee in the morning was not poverty. It was the habit of a lifetime. It was the kitchen she carried with her. It was her, still cooking, still here.
Pork dripping toast was a breakfast born of thrift, where nothing from a meal ever went unused. After roasting pork, families saved the fat drippings, which cooled and solidified into a spreadable form. Spread over a slice of bread and warmed, it became a quick, filling meal that carried both flavor and energy. Children often ate it before school, while adults grabbed it before heading to long days of work. The taste was rich and salty, a reminder of the meat that provided it even when only fat remained. Pork dripping toast reflected both scarcity and ingenuity, turning something that might otherwise be discarded into sustenance. It was a dish remembered fondly for its practicality, though it spoke clearly of hard times. For many, the memory of pork dripping toast carries with it the smell of the kitchen, the sound of a skillet cooling, and the resourcefulness of families who could not afford to waste a single drop. It was humble, yet deeply tied to survival. Crackling bread was the sound and taste of tradition. Grandparents saved every pork scrap from butchering, frying them down until crisp. Those cracklings, salty and rich, were folded into cornbread batter that sizzled when it hit the skillet. The smell was deep, smoky, and warm, like comfort made edible. When it came out of the oven, the bread was golden brown, with crunchy bites hidden in every corner. It was heavy but satisfying, each piece holding the spirit of thrift and endurance. Families gathered around to eat it hot, breaking it apart with their hands. It was the kind of food that stretched a meal, that turned a handful of cornmeal and scraps into something filling and proud. Crackling bread was heritage baked into every crumb, a reminder that even the hardest times could taste good when shared together. The sound of the crust cracking filled the kitchen, mingling with laughter and the hum of stories passed down through generations. Every bite carried the memory of hard work, of families who found a way to turn survival into celebration. Served with greens or beans, it stood as proof that nothing from the land was wasted. In that bread lived history, care, and the soul of a people who made every meal mean something. Cabbage and ham hock stew was a breakfast that filled both stomachs and spirits. Cabbage, inexpensive and abundant, was simmered with ham hocks until tender and flavorful. The broth became rich with the smoky, salty essence of the ham, while the cabbage absorbed every bit of taste. Potatoes, onions, or other vegetables were sometimes added to stretch the stew further, making it both practical and hearty. Families ate it hot in the morning, ensuring they had enough fuel for long days in the fields or at work. The dish was economical, making use of inexpensive cuts of meat that might otherwise be overlooked. Yet it carried pride too, as it transformed humble ingredients into something comforting and sustaining. Cabbage and ham hock stew showed the ingenuity of African American cooks who knew how to bring depth of flavor from even the simplest foods. Though forgotten by many, it was once a breakfast that symbolized strength and tradition. Molasses biscuits were one of those breakfasts that felt both humble and rich, depending entirely on the memory you brought to the table. The biscuits themselves were simple, mixed from flour, fat, and whatever milk or water could be spared, but it was the molasses brushed over the top that made them special. The dark sweetness soaked into the warm bread, giving each bite a deep flavor that felt like comfort stretching back generations. Grandparents baked these because molasses was cheap, shelf-stable, and full of the kind of sweetness that made children smile even when times were tight. The smell alone could bring the whole household into the kitchen, filling the air with something warm and grounding. Some families served them with butter, letting it melt into every crack, while others ate them plain, enjoying the caramel-like richness all on its own. These biscuits were not fancy, but they tasted like care, like effort, like mornings where love was baked into every crumb. They were the kind of breakfast that lingered in your memory long after the plate was empty, reminding you of kitchens where nothing was wasted and everything was shared. Okra fritters were once a common breakfast food that made use of one of the most iconic crops in African American gardens. Fresh okra would be chopped, mixed with cornmeal and seasoning, and fried in small patties until golden brown. The result was crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, and full of earthy flavor that paired perfectly with hot coffee or milk. For families, okra fritters were both affordable and filling, using whatever the garden provided in abundance. They could be eaten plain, with cane syrup, or alongside eggs, making them versatile as well as practical. The dish reflected the deep agricultural roots of African American communities, where nothing grown went to waste. It was also a way of starting the day with something satisfying before long hours of labor. While okra remains popular in Southern cooking, the fritter form has faded from breakfast tables, leaving behind only the memory of mornings built on thrift and flavor. Stewed apples with cinnamon and lard were the warmth of winter mornings in the South. Grandparents would peel the apples by hand, their fingers quick and sure, tossing each slice into an iron pot that hissed when the fat hit the heat. A spoonful of lard went first. There was no butter to spare, melting into a glossy pool that would coat every piece of fruit. Sugar was added if there was any to be found, but most times the sweetness came from the apples themselves, coaxed out by patience and low flame. Cinnamon or nutmeg, if there was some hidden in the back of the cupboard, turned the smell into something magical. The apples softened slowly, curling into tender ribbons that glowed like amber. The air filled with a warmth that made even the poorest kitchen feel rich. Served over biscuits or eaten plain from a bowl, it was the kind of meal that made children quiet with joy. It cost almost nothing but felt like everything. Grandparents said it was food for the soul, and they were right. It soothed hunger, calmed hearts, and brought everyone closer to the table. Even when times were lean, stewed apples with lard reminded families that comfort could be made from what was already there. It wasn't just breakfast. It was love made visible through steam and sugar. Molasses cornmeal custard was a dish that offered sweetness and substance while depending only on pantry staples. Families baked it by whisking cornmeal, milk, eggs when available, and molasses into a smooth mixture that thickened into a soft pudding in the oven. It was inexpensive to prepare, but filling enough to feed a household, making it a beloved breakfast or after-supper treat. The flavor was earthy and rich, with the deep sweetness of molasses carrying through each bite. Children often looked forward to it as a rare indulgence in households where desserts were not common. Adults valued it for its practicality, since it used cheap ingredients that could stretch for days. Molasses cornmeal custard represented thrift, but it also carried warmth and a sense of care, showing how families turned necessities into moments of comfort. It became part of the memory of kitchens during times of struggle, a dish that balanced scarcity with sweetness. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were a sweet and savory breakfast that carried the flavor of Southern tradition. Grandparents often made sausage from scratch or bought it fresh, shaping it into patties with practiced hands. The patties sizzled in the skillet, filling the house with a smell that meant the day was off to a strong start. Once cooked, they were served alongside cane syrup, thick and dark, ready for dipping or drizzling. The combination of salty sausage and sweet syrup created a harmony that felt indulgent even when the ingredients were simple. It stuck to your ribs, kept you full, and tasted like a morning wrapped in warmth. Cane syrup was cheaper and easier to find than maple syrup, but it had a bold flavor all its own. Families passed down the preference across generations, pairing it with biscuits, sausage, and sometimes even eggs. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were more than breakfast. They were the memory of Sunday mornings, crowded tables, and laughter rising like steam from the skillet.
These kitchens are mostly quiet now, and the hands that fed a family on almost nothing are gone. Leave a name in the comments.